Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I write and talk about books, Broadway, and Star Wars under the name Gemma Tate, and today's a Star Wars day. We're going to talk about the New Republic, which for those of you who are maybe less in the weeds on the Star Wars stuff, that's going to be the era after the original trilogy, so after the Battle of Endor, and prior to the Rise of the First Order, so the sequels trilogy. So we're going to talk about how it formed, why it failed, so how we get to the Rise of the First Order, and what the New Republic can teach us about our own history. A few quick notes. A lot of what I'm talking about here is going to be from Claudia Gray's Bloodline or from the Aftermath books. I know, we're talking about Disney canon, but listen, I talk a lot about Legends on here, mostly on shorts, but still on this very channel. But this conversation isn't that. When we're talking about the New Republic, we're going to work within the existing canon, which is the current Disney canon, and this is going to be a discussion of some excellent books that handle the lore with a lot of care and grace, and also they're damn talented authors, so we're going to be respectful of that, okay? On this note, I highly recommend, if you're not already, engaging with the books and the comics and the shows outside of just the Star Wars movies, especially if you are, like me, frustrated with the movie's portrayal of women, or if you just want more political intrigue. Like if you watched Andor and Mon Mothma's storyline was your favorite part of it, boy oh boy do I have book recommendations for you. Anyway, as always, we are talking about fiction, except also we're kind of not, because I've got a couple of history degrees and the world is on fire, and I do my best on this channel to foster a strong sense of pattern recognition. Anyway, the New Republic. In world history, the New Republic is formed after the Battle of Endor, so when the Rebel Alliance ceases to be the Rebel Alliance and becomes the New Republic, the new iteration of the Galactic Republic. And that's going to be led primarily by a combination of Leia Organa, Princess Leia, and Mon Mothma. Bail is out of the picture as of that first movie in the original trilogy. Admiral Akbar and Wedge Antilles are busy. They are shoring up the New Republic's security, so they are not getting involved in government. But Mon Mothma looks around and goes, okay, we led a rebellion, what's next? Because leading a rebellion and governing the people are not the same thing, and she realizes that really fast. And she goes, okay, we're gonna need a government to deal with all of this. And here's the thing. They don't have a lot of time to come up with a new government because there are a lot of planets that had been organized under the Empire that had been, by the way, co-opted into dealing with one another when they didn't really want to in the first place under the Galactic Republic throughout the Clone Wars. And so Mon looks around and goes, okay, we need a system of governance and we need one fast. Let's build it on the bones of the old system. The Galactic Republic wasn't perfect, but it worked. We're going to use that as the basis for our system, and we're going to be the New Republic. All the planets are going to get a senator. Problem solved. Problem is not solved. There were a lot of planets that didn't have a voice at all under the Empire, let alone the Galactic Republic. There are a lot of planets that had a voice, but it got ignored. And there are plenty of planets that never had any representation at all. So there are a handful of mechanisms that allow this to happen, where they have to organize all of these planets that have needed representation for a lot of years, and most of them haven't had it at all, and they get them all organized. And the way that that happens, it's actually really cute. Mon Mothma's off being the first Chancellor of the New Republic, and the very first senator from Chandrila, which is Mon Mothma's home planet, is giving basically a presentation at an award ceremony, and is basically sitting there like, hey, the New Republic is really great, you should come and join it, and we're not gonna be like the Empire, I promise we're the good guys. And she gets a piece of rotten fruit thrown at her, and she looks around, she's like, what was that? And the person who threw it says, my people saved up every spare credit that we have to send me here to tell you that your New Republic kinda sucks. And because she is well trained, because Mon Mothma was good at listening to people, and this woman learned from Mon's example. And she says, okay, I'd appreciate it if you didn't throw any more fruit at me, but tell me more about that. And this guy says, listen, under the Empire, things were bad. We weren't listened to, we didn't have a voice, but we've never had a voice because we didn't have a voice in the Galactic Republic either. And nobody's listening to us. And you guys are just marching in here with your former rebellion, you're not the Rebel Alliance anymore, you're the New Republic. We don't know anything about you or your system of governance, and we don't have a voice in your government. And this woman stops and she says, hey, you do have a voice in our government now. You're the new senator for your planet. Your people saved up all of their credits to send you here. So obviously they trust you to be their voice. Great, you're going to be their voice in the New Republic Senate. And as she's traveling throughout the galaxy on her way to that first meeting of the Senate, she just keeps picking up additional senators because she starts making stops at every planet along the way and saying, hey, do you not have a voice? Do you want to have a voice? All right, quick, on the spot elections, or quick, on the spot, your people sent you here to go complain to me. You're coming with us. And as a result, the New Republic is way, way bigger than the Galactic Republic ever was, and then the Empire ever, tried to be. Because remember, the Empire was all about consolidating and assimilating. The Galactic Republic was splintering as worlds split off to be separatists as opposed to sticking with the Galactic Republic. And then they were at war. They were not all involved in one same system of governance. So the New Republic is massive and involves little teeny tiny worlds that have never had a voice before. And that's a good thing. But the New Republic is kind of doomed to fail from the start, because remember, the New Republic is the Star Wars version of Reconstruction, which in our real world history is what went on in the American South from 1863 towards the end, but not the actual end of the Civil War, all the way through 1877. I can talk more about that in a different video if you want. It's essentially where it becomes very clear that laws being written into place versus the way that they are codified are going to mean very, very different things for America's future. We're seeing a lot of that play out right now. But the New Republic is basically doomed to fail the moment that they do not do a systemic audit of their funding and the mechanisms that underpin not only local leadership in a lot of places, but also things like production and economy and security and the incarceration system after the decades-long militarized rule of the Empire, as well as the multiple years of militarized rule and consolidated power under the Galactic Republic. And this is where it becomes really clear to us, and this is something that we should be paying attention to if we are trying to read deeper into Star Wars. The Emperor alone, Palpatine alone, was not the reason for the rise of the Empire. Don't get me wrong, it was a multi-decade long process of the Sith gaining foothold after foothold of power and Palpatine's own plans coming to fruition, sure. But he couldn't have done it alone. What we're looking at when we look at, in the prequels era, the eventual takeover of Palpatine's empire, what we are really looking at is a multi-decade long process of a governmental takeover through capitalism, through tech billionaires, through war profiteering, through encouraging small, petty fights between people who might have stood together arm in arm in another world where they weren't being manipulated by Palpatine at the center of it all, but also they were getting into those petty fights without Palpatine's influence also. We have the installation of the banks into the system of government. They are given a voice in the Galactic Republic as though the banks are their own entity within the Senate. The Death Star's construction is done first for the Separatists and then for the Republic. The Republic encounters the Death Star, specifically Orson Krennic as an engineer for the Republic, and goes, hey, you're building a nice fancy war machine. We want that. And it is built for the Republic before it becomes the war machine of the Empire. The creation of a surveillance state happens under the Galactic Republic, not strictly speaking under the Empire. The vote of no confidence that actually allows Palpatine to become the Chancellor, yes, that's Palpatine's manipulation, but also the prior Chancellor was not doing a very good job of being a Chancellor, which is why Padme is so easily manipulated into casting that vote of no confidence that removes him and installs Palpatine. Remember, what we're looking at is Palpatine's political power, not just his special magic Sith powers. And we're also looking at the ways that a lot of very small, localized cogs of power turn in this broader, wider system. And it has to do with a lot of local despotism and war profiteering from massive corporations. So, how does this all come home to roost? How does this all doom the New Republic? Basically, again, not to draw too many parallels to our real world history, except we're absolutely drawing those parallels to our real world history. Mon Mothma says, hey guys, I'm gonna go retire. I've been doing this for like 20 years and I wasn't young when we started. Maybe don't become a multi-party system. Infighting will tear this government down. It becomes a two-party system pretty much immediately, and everything goes to shit from there. The two parties that form are the centrists, which theoretically are all about local centralized control within the systems that are not outer rim, tiny little worlds that have never had representation before. They're the big worlds with lots of money and lots of consolidated power, and they want to retain that consolidated power, and they want to represent really mostly only themselves, and they're just kind of expecting all the smaller worlds to fall in line. And then there's the populists who are wandering around being like, hey guys, everybody should have equal representation, especially the people whose local sense of autonomy was completely squashed by the empire for 25 years. Cool, maybe we should do that. And the centrists also include a very special little subcategory of imperial history enthusiasts, 25 years after the empire has fallen, who are kind of blending race supremacy within the galaxy with this like nostalgia for imperial control and for imperial artifacts. And this is why it's really important to note that the empire's control wasn't a bad thing for everyone under the empire. And for the people who profited under it, there was a certain nostalgia 25 years later for that degree of like law and order where everything was black and white and simple, except for, when it wasn't and you got accused of treason without doing anything because you said something that the government didn't like under a surveillance state. But whatever, there are like really some true loyalists who are not removed from power. Because again, the New Republic does not do a particularly good job of rooting out the imperial remnants and getting rid of them. Instead, they're just like, oh, they'll reform, and they go through reformation programs. Or, oh, we can't actually rule without these systems of economics, incarceration, security, production. And so the people who had been running those things, their figureheads get removed, sure. But the people who had been running those things for years and years and years and years, they just get to stay. And so it's not a surprise, really, that those people turn out to have an awful lot of nostalgia for their empire days. And that is going to be a problem. There is, in fact, a rising little pro-empire resistance movement. And Leia, because Leia is not stupid, picks up on that and is investigating it. And she is about to out that information to the entire Senate when somebody decides to out her heritage for the specific purpose of staining Leia's reputation by her familial associations. Yeah, there's no parallels to real world history whatsoever with this. And they out, and by they, I mean one of Leia's own relatives, outs the information that Vader was Leia's father. And this information crashes any credibility that Leia has ever had with the Senate. Never mind anything that she herself has done. Never mind the years that she spent as an active leader in the rebellion. Never mind the years that she spent first as a senator in the Imperial Senate before that was dissolved, but also as a leader within the New Republic. All of a sudden, none of that matters. She is Vader's daughter in the eyes of the government and in the eyes of the people that she has been charged with representing. And the information is devastating to the populist movement. And what's even worse about this, by the way, is that it's not just that the information is outed by a relative who had been trusted with information that Bail had left recorded for Leia, with not just the information about Vader, but also the entire history and legacy of Padme as Leia's biological mother. And this is a recording that Bail has left for his little girl in the event that maybe Bail doesn't make it through this rebellion, that at the time that he records it, it's just a fledgling little concept. It has not yet become the Rebel Alliance. Bail does not yet know what kind of leader Leia is going to become when he records this. Leia, at this point, has known for 25 years who her biological parents were and has decided that she does not want anybody else to know. She does not ever want to think about it again. Vader, to her, from the original trilogy onwards, is always going to be the guy who tortured her and then made her watch as the Death Star got pointed at her home. She does not want to cope with this information. She has not told her own son about this information. And it is outed to the entire Senate, not just by a relative, but also simultaneously by somebody that Leia has reached across the aisle to and become friends with. And it is devastating. And what's honestly more heartbreaking about it to me is that this is the moment when Padme's legacy is finally completely subsumed by Vader's, because 25 years after the original trilogy, nearly 40 years after the prequel trilogy, Padme's legacy has pretty much been completely forgotten. The only people carrying it forward are really the Amidalans, who are kind of off in a ship trying to do their own thing, just trying to survive through the rebellion. And in this moment, it becomes very clear that nobody is ever going to want to touch Padme's legacy with a 10-foot pole ever again because of the ways in which it is intertwined with Vader's. And it leaves Padme's story wholly consumed by the men of her family. And that is further cemented by Kylo Ren knocking down the statue of Padme on Naboo just a few years later. But in any case, yes, there's some casual misogyny involved here. Yes, there's a lot of rumor spreading that is immediately awful. And the overall effect is that Leia becomes completely unelectable. And the person who becomes first senator, which is essentially a chancellor who has less of a symbolic figurehead role and more of a legislative get stuff done type role, which that's the position that Leia is up for when this begins to happen. The person who becomes the first senator instead is dead set on inaction as policy, intentionally letting the government structures that are in place play themselves out in order to encourage local rule, in order to encourage populist principles. And in response, the centrists, the party of small consolidated government, finally have the excuse to shift from being the party of small limited government to being the party of authoritarian government overreach. So from this context, we get two things really. We get the rise of the First Order, including Ben Solo's renewed interest in his Confederate, imperial grandfather. But we also get a very clear view of the war profiteers who are funding both sides of first the rebellion and the empire, and then the New Republic and the First Order in its fledgling state. And they begin to set out their base on Canto Bight with this encouragement of local rule. And these war profiteers end up being able to make a profit no matter who wins the wars to come. And they're building on a system that was clearly set up during the Clone Wars between the Separatists and the Republic. But we have this very clear established precedent within Star Wars that the funding is coming from both sides in almost every single conflict from the same place. The funding on any side of a given violent conflict in Star Wars is coming from the same sets of billionaires who will make a profit no matter who wins because they're kind of betting on everybody and they're providing weapons to everybody because they make a profit when people buy weapons. But we also get a secret third thing, which is Leia's backbone of absolute steel. Because when all of this goes down, she sees the writing on the wall and she knows that it is time to lead a rebellion against something again. And she knows how to do that. So she grits her teeth and she prepares for it, and she grabs Han and she says, hey, I know you didn't want to do this ever again, but we're going to have to do this ever again. So let's start networking and let's build a resistance as best as we can. And they do. And that's what built us up into the sequels trilogy. So what can we learn from this? I feel like the number one takeaway is that when somebody says that they are representing the party of small limited government, and they also have like a weird fascination with the losing side of a war over authoritarianism and human rights abuse, question that. Ask questions. Think about that really critically. Think about what their actions are showing you versus what the words coming out of their mouth are telling you. Cool, cool. This also tells us, number two, that getting rid of the bad guy is not usually enough. Getting rid of Palpatine, not enough. You also have to tear down the systems of power that allowed for their rise in the first place and that propped them up while they were in power. If you don't do that, then you are just creating the stepping stones for somebody else to come in and fill that power vacuum. Also, on this note, number three, governing and rebelling have overlapping but not identical skill sets. The person who leads your rebellion might not actually be the best figurehead to take over once it's done. And the fourth and final takeaway here is that maybe the Star Wars sequels were not as bad as we all made fun of them for being, particularly when it comes to the representation of the rise of neo-fascism. And I do think that it's worth considering our own complacency when we all sat there and said, oh, that could never happen. And I think, just separately, I think that it is helpful to have a shared vocabulary to talk about some of this, especially when we're not always ready to talk about some of this in our current real world social and political contexts. And so even if that vocabulary is couched in fictional worlds and fictional world terminologies, I still think it's helpful to talk about it. That's it for now. A few quick notes. I think that if you want to get into my comment section and call the Empire or the First Order the good guys and be like, yeah, life was great under the Empire and the Jedi were the bad guys, free speech allows you to do and say whatever you would like. I'm not going to get in the way of that. You can do and say whatever you would like. But free speech does not shield you from the consequences of doing that on my page in my comment section where I have a block button. Cool. Anyway, if you want more Star Wars content, I know I usually do this in short form, but if you like the longer form videos, let me know. Likewise, history content. I've got 2 whole degrees in that. If you want to hear more about real world history, I'm happy to talk about that. Just let me know in the comments. That is going to be it for now, and I will catch you all in the next one. Bye!